Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is Angelo Ponzi. He describes himself as a fractional CMO or Chief Marketing Officer, a business advisor, a marketing architect, a keynote speaker, and an author. He also has a podcast called The Business Growth Cafe, and he is the founder and president of the Ponzi Group, his company. So, Angelo, thank you for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I love conversations like this.
Yeah, well, you do a lot of interviewing, and so the tables are turned a little bit today. Hopefully, that'll be fun for you.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. What marketer doesn't like to talk?
That's a good question. Yeah, do marketers tend to be extroverted, or
I think so. I haven't met too many introverts that are in the marketing side. And so it certainly makes for a dynamic room when there's a bunch of us in there all trying to jockey for position.
yeah? So before we talk about your favorite mistake, I mean, I do want to ask you, and I mean, it's an elephant in the room. It's got to be a challenge in the business world or starting a company with the last name Ponzi. That's not your fault, but that's a
Y-
challenge, or is it funny?
Well, you know what? It's an interesting dynamic because it is brought up every day, at least once. Usually, the first person I talk to, which is actually you today, I was just skimming the news on my phone, and there it is once again, Ponzi scheme by somebody in Hollywood. I didn't get the details yet, but so probably the biggest challenge it was years ago in my when I had my advertising agency. We worked with a lot of financial institutions, so you can imagine that came up very quickly. And so we used to take bets, and my partners and I, we would place bets, and I would say like within 10 seconds, and they were like, "Oh, you're foolish, nobody's going to bring that up, they don't even know us." Sure enough, I won pretty much all of those bets. And so I won't say it's been a challenge, but it certainly has been prevalent. Madoff made it infamous. And it's interesting. What I think it has become is the Ponzi scheme has become synonymous with any kind of scheme. Because a lot of times they're calling out, like I was watching a movie the other day, and they go, "Oh, it's a big Ponzi scheme." It had nothing to do with what the Ponzi scheme is about. It was just somebody was ripping somebody off. So it's like Kleenex and Xerox, right? They become synonymous with copying and tissues, and now Ponzi has become synonymous with schemes.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so yeah. So okay, we'll move past that. Yeah. In my mind, that wasn't necessarily a creative or unique question, but I felt like at least wanted to bring that up.
But I do use it to my advantage. Anytime I present, I use it within the first 30, okay, when you heard my name, raise your hands, how many people thought of the Ponzi scheme? I get a lot of laughs and smiles and giggles.
Sure.
So that's my icebreaker.
I guess yeah. Use it to your advantage, right?
Absolutely.
Did you ever consider not using your name with the businesses though, or I mean,
Well, and I'm about ready to rebrand actually. So the Ponzi Group, which is my current business, was actually my business that I sold about 15 years ago. And about 3 years ago, I was cruising on GoDaddy looking for some URLs, and for giggles, I typed in the name and it was available. So I bought it back, and I sat on it for about a year, and then I said, "Hey, you know what? It was successful once before. It was some great vibes. So I'm going to use it again." But I spend more time not talking about the name, so we've decided to rebrand.
okay. So let's move past the name. We'll talk about other things here. Looking back at the different things you've done in your career, Angelo, what comes to mind for you in terms of something that's a favorite mistake?
Well, I'm going to, and this is hopefully education for people as well, but I'm going to go back. I have several here that I've jotted notes down, but probably the biggest one was my first venture into my own business. I was young, I was about 23, and I was working for an advertising agency, and we were doing a lot of commercials. And I met production people, and I was really interested in that side of the business. And they convinced me that we could start a film production company. I was the money guy. They were supposedly the people with the leads. And so I jumped headfirst, never asked a single question. I just totally believed what they were telling me, and in and out in 8 months. So that was a huge lesson, that to really do due diligence. And so that was a costly mistake, because it had been, money my parents had been saving for, when I got out of school, and give me a little nest egg, and I blew it all in one shot. So that kind of made it a little difficult going down the path. So that was probably the biggest mistake and lesson that I learned early on.
Does it go into that category of something better to learn that early than later? I'm sure that stuck with you and influenced how you evaluate other opportunities, right?
Oh, absolutely. When I got to my second time, which was only 7 years later, I spent a lot of time doing due diligence, trying to understand, what the opportunities were, the people that I was partnering with, asked a ton more questions. And so that actually consulting job that I started, or a company, actually morphed into my agency, which I eventually sold. So I was very cautious about doing that due diligence and making sure that I had the facts.
Yeah. I wonder if it was difficult to avoid having the pendulum swing too far in the other way of being too cautious, or I mean, imagine after that first time, you've got to figure out how to trust other business partners again, or
Well, you know what? I would say you would think I'd learn a lesson, but I actually didn't, uh, because I jumped headfirst into a investment that I saw a lot of my friends in, and it went sour, and we lost a bunch of money. But once again, it was that trust and believability, because other people were doing it. People were telling me, "Hey, this is great. I'm making a lot of money." So you you have to, for me anyway, you learn those lessons. Get reminded of those lessons along the way, and so it took a few times to get me to think a little more about jumping head first into things. I'm a little impulsive when it comes to that.
yeah. So thinking back to that film production company, was that going to be in the advertising space, or meaning films like Hollywood
Commercial.
releases?
Yeah, it
Okay,
was
yeah,
commercial. So what they convinced me, so I'm in Orange County, California. They convinced me we could bring Hollywood to Orange County. What did I know? I had stars. I was ready to go. Had these visions of ultimately moving from marketing to be a director, and had done some things on set. And what we found very quickly is that didn't work. And so we spent all our time in Hollywood, but we spent more of our time really as per crew as opposed to our own work. And then those guys, so I'm 23, they're 45 and 48 respectively. And they got disenchanted very quickly, and drifted, and left me, holding, rent, the building, all the stuff that we had jumped into, because they just didn't care anymore.
oh gosh. So instead of bringing the work or the big names, or Hollywood down to Orange County, you ended up on the road a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah, working in
Brutal
LA every
commuting.
day. Yeah, every day we drive to LA, and hire ourselves as crew, and work that. So the vision wasn't there, but more importantly, when they changed their direction, I didn't know enough, right? I didn't have those, even the production connection. So I found myself once again, out on an island without really understanding it. Those days, which is another mistake I've made over the years, is not maintaining that network. You tend to work a job, you move to a job, you forget about maybe the people that you're working with, and so several times throughout my career, I've had to rebuild that network, because frankly, I walked away from it when I didn't really need to, just stupidity.
Yeah, and I think there's another really good lesson there. I think, yeah, if people are searching for a job, I've heard people say the time for networking is when you don't need something. You're maintaining those relationships. So then when you have maybe a need, or you're in a situation where you reach out, it's not as awkward, or it's not as transactional if you're
Right.
maintaining those connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maintaining your network and networking is work. I mean, if you have a broad, I mean, I have a broad network now, and just to touch base with the key people, I mean, it's a job, and it has to, and I plan it out now. Each day I reach out to one or two, just to, whether it's an email or a quick phone call, or just because I need to stay present and stay, top of mind. And that's, where, frankly, where a lot of my referrals come from these days, is that network as opposed to new business activity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great advice, Angelo. So I'd be curious then to learn more about your work in your business and how you help clients. What does it mean? How do you define marketing architect within the realm of marketing or advertising or different activities?
Sure. So what I do is I focus more on the strategic and analytical side of marketing, not the tactical. And I'm always looking holistically at the organization. And so I get involved, one of my clients, for example, I mean, I oversaw sales. I got involved with manufacturing and inventory management and HR and finance, because I really pushed myself into the various departments, because whether we're successful or not successful has an impact on the entire organization. That's the way I believe. So for me, in looking at as a marketing architect, I like to say you wouldn't build a house without having a blueprint. And that's really what we're doing, is we're setting the foundation, the blueprint for growth. And so we spend a lot of time looking at, or either conducting or looking at market research, trying to understand the market, the competition, the prospects, the customers, why they buy, why don't they buy, what's going on. And we're using that information to leverage on positioning and messaging. So we'll do a lot of branding work, but just not the visual branding, but the messaging from a branding standpoint. And then I work on a lot of strategic plans. Where do you want to be in 3 years? How are we going to get there? And it could be marketing, it could be sales, it could be acquisition. And so that's where kind of the marketing architect, right? We're building that blueprint, and from which is, well, you probably can't see on my little screen here. Maybe you can because it's bigger on yours, but it says marketing architect. And so the new brand of the company will reflect that, more of that marketing architect. And then what we like to say is, once the plans are in place, we become general contractors. And then we manage external teams to build off the blueprint.
Yeah. Have you announced what that future brand is, or is that coming down the road?
Well, interesting. It's the cobbler in his son's shoes. My target was January 1st. Here we are, March or April 7th, and we're probably another 2 or 3 weeks away. Yeah, because I have to go back and redo all my videos. I have to go, change the website, all the material. So we're really trying to take our time with it. And of course, we have client work, so that, you know, my work goes on the back burner.
Yeah. So I'm thinking back to my MBA days and that education. And I remember one thing I learned, it might be a misperception amongst people, is when we think of marketing, people really think often of advertising.
Hmm.
And so I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that misunderstanding and how important it is not to just come up with like a slick ad, but to really think about positioning and messaging. Why is that so important to a business?
Right. Well, at the end of the day, advertising, whether it's print, it's TV, it's digital, whether it's trade shows, whatever it happens to be, those are the tactical, those are the channels of communications. But ultimately, you need to make sure you understand your customer. I have a mantra of mine: know your customer. So I spend a lot of time really digging into the nuances of what's important to them, what are their motivations, what are their buying behaviors. Is there multiple people within the companies that you're targeting to? Because you have to be able to speak to them. And that's where I think is one of the most important aspects of, I'll say, marketing as a whole, because you're trying to understand how to communicate and be relevant within to that customer. But then you also have to look at vertical markets. You have to understand, market shares on the competition, who owns what's brand perception. What if you're, so I've just completed a study, for example, with a software company that wants to launch. We went out and understood how important the product is to the marketplace, what feature sets are important to launch with, because they had 10 features, we only need 5 to launch. So we just save them a ton of money and a ton of time so they could get to market quicker. We have to understand, the scope of the competition, who's the leaders. When you come into a marketplace and you're like these folks, they're a challenger, right? They're not a leader. That's a different way to approach the market, a different way to speak. So marketing really gets into those nuances and the devil's in the details, in the sense of how do you map that growth, and then the channels of communication, and that's advertising and trade shows and PR and social media. Those are how to deliver that message.
Yeah. So are there certain industries that you tend to work with? Who are your customers as a marketing architect?
Sure. So I'm fortunate. I've been on both sides, so B2B and B2C. So my speak is I've literally worked with semiconductor manufacturing equipment all the way to ice cream. So based on, but I believe in the principles of marketing, as opposed to that I have to be an expert in a specific vertical. Why? Because ultimately they all apply. And if you understand how to get information, you understand how to utilize information, I can deal in any category. It's really what I don't like to play in, and that's usually pharmaceuticals. But other than that, I've worked with a lot of software this year, startups to probably $50 million software companies, some manufacturing and distribution. But I've also worked in apparel and shoes, and started getting back into some alcoholic beverage. So very diverse client
Mm-hmm.
base.
Yeah. So, well, I'm curious, when you worked through with a company, I think that question of like understanding why somebody buys your product or hires you for a service, I think that's a really interesting thing for business to understand. Do you find sometimes that clients of yours, without naming names or anything too specific, of course, do they have some mistaken understanding? They think people are buying because of this, and it turns out to be something different. Are you helping them sometimes unearth that, or is it more a matter of refining their understanding?
It's both, actually. Um, like I'm working with a company right now who came to me and said, we think our messaging is off. We think, frankly, our company vision is off. And so we did some work to understand that, a 35-year-old company, that they started adding stuff to who they were, and therefore confused the marketplace about what their offerings are and how they're positioned. So we went in and we clarified that, and kind of put them on the right path. And now we're going back and changing how they speak by understanding the needs and wants of the marketplace. They have a couple different customer bases, and so we have to understand how to speak to that user versus the other user. And we also always look at the overarching company message. So it really kind of depends. I worked with a company in the commercial Christmas business, if you will. And one of the things I noticed when we started working with them, they were always talking to their clients, potential clients, about how great the product was, and that it was, ultimate quality, and it wouldn't weather, and blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, it was like, who cares? What you want to tell them, who their customers were, malls and entertainment centers, that we're going to create memories for your customers. People are going to want to come to your mall or come to your entertainment center because they want to have pictures and selfies and experiences with their families. That's what you're creating with your products. That's the way you need to talk to them. And oh yeah, it's quality stuff too. It'll last, right? That's the reason to believe us. And so the whole way they spoke, and this was a 30-year-old company, and so they totally changed how they spoke to their customers. And they had 5 different vertical markets. There were more when we started looking at them, and we were able to narrow it down to 5 where their revenue was going to come from. Talking about marketing, we were able to dig in and understand that if a company bought today, or a mall, let's say, they wouldn't buy again for 3 years. They might, do some upgrades, but they would never make a big purchase. So we were able to map out cycles. We were able to look at, if they made an installation in the Midwest, they didn't have people there, we had to go find installers. We looked at how could we grow, where should we have warehousing. So, from a strategic marketing standpoint, it's much more than I need a social media campaign, or, upgrade my website, right?
Sure. Those are tactics.
Exactly.
Yeah. Are there you've touched on a couple mistakes? It sounds like companies having messaging that's off the mark or unclear or inconsistent messaging. There's a mistake in trying to talk about a mistake. Inconsistent messaging or not understanding their customer is another mistake. Are there any other mistakes that you see companies make in general? Is there something that you then in your work try to help them? Is there a mistake you help them avoid making?
Right. I would say, 6 out of every 10 calls I get, they want to go right to tactics. We need lead gen. Okay, well, who are we targeting? What do we want to do? And they're unclear. They just know they want to generate leads. And so I, try to push them upstream because I feel sure I can do that, but I'm not sure the messaging is going to be right. I'm not sure the way we communicate. And so again, I feel a lot of companies are in a hurry and don't take the time to do the due diligence to really understand it. When you get into large corporations, which I've worked with, a lot of them can't even launch their television commercials that we see today from big corporations because they have to do copy testing and has to meet certain norms. In some cases, it could take months that you're constantly reworking your commercials because they're not delivering. So, but yet smaller companies just want to throw it out there. They're the ones that, don't necessarily have the money to waste, yet they're willing to waste money.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's. I mean, I think there's a general business challenge there. People are in a hurry, or they're looking at short-term results as opposed to stepping back and being more strategic and looking at, I guess, of the foundation of
Mhm.
the positioning. Why put out an ad that's, I mean, I watch, ads, and you wonder sometimes, is the criteria creating an entertaining ad or an ad that's effective? And maybe they can be one and the same. But I imagine, if people want to put out a slick ad that communicates something that isn't compelling to customers, that would be a pitfall of rushing into the tactics.
Right. Well, think about how many commercials you see on television, for example, and at the end you went, who is that company? Who's it for? I mean, that just costs a lot of money. And we as consumers have no idea who the brand was. Maybe they said it at the end, but we have no idea the relevancy of it. And, the media spend is expensive. And of course, production is expensive. So to me, they're just throwing dollars away without. And so that gets back to, again, thinking things through. And especially when you come to social media and those kinds, it's too easy. I mean, literally, we could hit talk today, right now, and an hour from now, we could be, buying ads on Facebook. I mean, it's that quick. And yeah, you could throw 500 or 1,000 or whatever number of dollars, and it's a hit and miss because we're not testing. We're not really trying to understand. And I think that's kind of what this kind of digital world has done in a sense, is it's just too easy to get out there without any thought and really thinking things through.
Mm-hmm. Too easy to throw money away. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard over and
Yeah.
over again. I spent a lot of time in the action sports industry, and one of the things they used to tell me is, "Well, I could spend, $5,000 on your research, but that'll buy me a couple ads, so I'll just do that."
Mm,
I don't
yeah.
really. Well, I have, and so again, they were just not thinking things through and willing to toss money away.
Yeah. There was one example that you use on your website. You mentioned earlier alcoholic beverages, and I do like wine. And there was an example, again, I'm sure, maybe you can tell the story generally about some of the work that you did. I'd be curious how a winery, a wine brand, would be looked at this way. What were some of the things that you did that helped them boost demand and drive sales?
Sure. Well, I've got a couple different wine stories. One, I'll tell you real quick, which was an avoidance of a big mistake, is there was a brand that was converting from a winery to and they wanted to reposition themselves as a coastal brand. That was going to be every wine in their portfolio was going to be labeled coastal. There were some competitors out there. Well, here in Southern California, we went, hey, coastal, we'll go down, we'll take pictures of the ocean. Isn't that great and wonderful? It makes a lot of sense. the last minute, we hesitated and decided to do some market research. And so we decided to get it out of California because the wine was sold nationally. We traveled across the country to areas where bodies of water existed. We basically said, what does coastal mean to you? It meant something very different to somebody sitting on the ocean versus sitting on a lake versus sitting on, a river. And so we realized the way we started to position it would have been totally wrong, that it wouldn't have been relevant to, frankly, most of the states in the union here. So that was a huge mistake that we avoided. One of the things that, and I go back to another wine brand, they were having problems. It was once a very successful wine, still is, but commanded a high price. It was a special wine. And one day the owner came to us and said, it's really lost its cachet. And instead of buying it for $16 a bottle, you can now buy it for, $5.95. You can find it at the local chili cook-offs. So people just stopped seeing it that way. And so we conducted some research, and what we found is the company was perceived as a big conglomerate owned by a faceless corporation, blah, blah. And so in understanding those perceptions, we were able to, through our advertising, was to change those. That was what we wanted to do. We wanted to change the perception of the brand. We had 26 attributes. 13 we wanted to see rise, like owned by a single owner. And the other 13 we wanted to see go down. And that's how we measured that on a quarterly basis. So talking about investing in research and understanding your customer. We kept a pulse on that brand we had them for 8 years in our agency. And every quarter we would do studies to make sure that things were moving in the direction that we wanted them to move. And it's important because otherwise, how do you communicate that? We didn't know. I mean, we got the owner to put signatures on the bottles to personalize them. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of nuances on making that shift in behavior.
Yeah. Well, one thing that stands out from your story there is the power of testing an idea. In entrepreneurship circles, that's been something that's been a big focus the last decade or longer, of like, don't have what you think is a brilliant idea, work on it in isolation in a cave for 2 years and then launch. Like, at some point you've got to go and test the idea, test the market, test the business model, and iterate. So it sounds like that was a key part of that coastal, like somebody I'm sure was convinced it was a great idea. And I imagine sometimes people are afraid to test because they don't want to be, if you will, proven wrong. But I guess better to learn that early than it would be to be proven wrong in a large, expensive way. Fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of companies, I call it, talking to themselves, sitting in the boardroom and making their own decisions. And there's a story I tell, I won't mention the company name, but it was around 3D televisions. So Avatar came out, everybody 3D was excited, and 3 brands rolled out and was trying to be first to market with the 3D television. And one of them was, and their sales took off, all the early adopters. And about 3 to 4 years in, I think it started to tank. And they eventually left the market. And it was traced back to primarily a single reason, is that they never did any research to find out how we as consumers would feel about wearing 3D glasses all the time to watch television. It was that simple. And it came up in the study that I was reading that it was asked in the boardroom. Somebody brought it up and they were dismissed. Don't worry about it. People will love this. And so they did no research, no testing. They just rushed to market, and 5 years later, it was a failure.
Yeah, I think I had one TV that was probably purchased a decade ago that had 3D as a feature, but it was completely incidental to me. I never bought the glasses. I never tried to look, and nowadays that's not even a feature anymore. They just say, okay, nope, doesn't work. People aren't using it. Not compelling. That's not why people were buying a TV, I guess.
Yeah. So, there's so many times that, to your point earlier, you have a great idea, build it and they will come, and, the field of dreams, and people spend countless hours, time, money to develop this product. They roll it out and nobody buys it. And it could be a fantastic product. But if you didn't, do the marketing side and understand how to communicate and, where to buy, where to reach people, you're destined for, I won't say failure, but you're certainly destined for a hard time.
Sure. So, Angelo, before we wrap up here, I do want to ask a little bit about your podcast, the Business Growth Cafe. I imagine you talk about topics like this. Who are the types of people you talk to on the podcast? What are some of the things you cover?
Sure. It's a variety of folks. I mean, I try to get a lot of business owners, so small business, small, medium size. I get some startup folks on there. And part of it is the whole show is really about, like yours, business advice, lessons learned. And ultimately, through those lessons, we're imparting some kind of wisdom to the listeners. But I also have a lot of people like myself in the sense of uh, providers. So from sales and marketing to finance to operations, so a wide variety of folks. But I've got into people that deal with the mental health side of businesses, a lot of consulting, ghost book writers. So really trying to nurture that entrepreneur and small business owner, how they can, utilize this information to move forward. I do some solos, which I've done over the years. Sometimes I'm inspired. Sometimes I ran out of inventory on my on my shows, and I had to do something really quick. So yeah, that's really the focus. It came about. I had guested on a few shows years back, and I thought this is really interesting and cool. And I spent about 4 months actually working on the concept and how I wanted to approach it, and then finally did it. And I'm in 3.5 years now.
Well, great. So people can find, I'm sure, that podcast wherever they have found My Favorite Mistake. And you can also go to businessgrowthcafe.com. That'll forward to the website for the podcast. And again, you can learn more about Angelo's work at theponzigroup.com. But if and when that website changes before this is released, I'll make sure that the link in the show notes represents whatever the new branding and possible domain name might be.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to do redirects too. So that was another mistake that I learned from somebody else is they changed the name, they rebranded, launched a new website, and they killed the other site. So all their, SEO and all the work and their presence on Google basically disappeared. And so that was a lesson learned from somebody else. So we're going to have two sites running at the same time.
Okay, well, good. Sometimes it is helpful to learn from other people's mistakes.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
one of the things I think that happens, maybe listening here to My Favorite Mistake. So again, our guest has been Angelo Ponzi. Angelo, really enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing some of your perspectives, your stories, some thoughts on marketing. Really helpful, really good stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.